Take advantage of the fact that a lot of human rights defenders from Mexico are in town this week for the hearings before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to just brief a few folks on the context of ongoing insecurity and violence in Mexico and the impact that has had on human rights in Mexico. As you may have seen in the press lately, there's been two mainly high-profile cases in Mexico, one involving the disappearance of 43 students from the state of Guerrero last month, and previously the execution of up to 22 unarmed individuals by the Mexican military in June of this year, and then ongoing concerns about the use of torture in Mexico. And I think this is important, one, because of this, obviously the gravity of the situation in Mexico, but also given the support the United States provides to Mexico through the Maureen initiative, primarily to work on institutional building, providing equipment for Mexico, both as a way to look at how effective this support has been, but also because Congress had put conditions on this assistance on human rights that involve how the Mexican government is effectively investigating and prosecuting public officials, the military and the police for human rights violations, and issues such as the prohibition on the use of testimony obtained through torture in hearings. I just wanted to say there's a lot of other organizations that were here this week from Mexico on human rights, but we wanted to focus on these areas primarily because of the importance of them in the context of security in Mexico and looking at how the U.S. engages with Mexico on these issues. One of our speakers is on her way, so I will present her when she arrives, but we were going to start with Perseo Quiroz from Amnesty International Mexico, mostly talking about their recent report on torture in Mexico, and then Luisa from the Tlachinollan Human Rights Center, which is based in Guerrero and is the organization providing assistance and working with the families of the students who disappeared, and then Stephanie Brewer from Human Rights Center in Mexico City, the Central Pro, working also on the case of the execution by the military of these civilians. So we will start with Perseo. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for coming and thanks for taking the time to listen about the human rights situation that is going in Mexico. I will just kind of like give background, very broad background of what the situation in Mexico is about human rights. Then I will turn on the floor to my colleagues that will explain a little bit more in detail some of the cases that they are undertaking. For Amnesty International as a movement, Mexico has been a priority country for several years. And it has been a priority country because we have seen quite a lot and very gross human rights violations. And that is obviously very concerning to us. But it's also a priority country given the influence that the country has over the whole continent. You know, Mexico, it's presented in the international scheme as a strong player in human rights. It supports a lot of treaties. Pretty much Mexico has signed every single treaty regarding human rights that has been issued or has been created and has been advocated a lot for human rights and human rights council. To the international community, maybe Mexico has a commitment to human rights. But when you are in the field and when you are in the country, you see that that commitment that usually is expressed verbally in these kind of international forums does not match the reality that is going on in Mexico. And that is something that we want to raise. Amnesty International did this year, before all these very tragic issues happened, high-level missions And so our Secretary General went to Mexico, and we met with President Peña Nieto, and we told him that we were very concerned that we didn't see the human rights issues being prioritized in the agenda. He said he had a commitment, but later on, we also remind him that the commitment shouldn't be just verbally and to us, but to the population, and to create public policies that would have human rights focus. We didn't see this. So mainly there is three problems. Well, there are many more, but I'm gonna broadly speak about three problems that are very concerning for Amnesty International. First of all, it's the problem of torture. We have issued our latest report on torture, which there are many copies there for you to take home if you want. And there are many key findings in that. One key finding is that torture in Mexico is still being generalized and persistent. It's generalized in the sense that we can find that mostly all law enforcement institutions do commit torture, and do commit torture in order to obtain confessions that are later on taken into criminal proceedings. So also we have seen that the number of complaints filed before the National Commission for Human Rights have increased 600% in the last decade. So that is very, very troubling and very concerning. And this is not taking into consideration also what happened at the local Human Rights Commission. As you may know, Mexico is a federal state, so we have a National Human Rights Commission that is in charge of kind of like looking after the federal government authorities, and then there is the state's authorities which have the local Human Rights Commission. And the local Human Rights Commission have been very negligent at documenting and at issuing reports about how many cases of torture there are in the country. So we have there a big black hole. And we're very concerned as well that evidence obtained under torture is still being presented before the court, even though the Mexican Supreme Court issued a ruling stating that no evidence taken under torture can be accepted in a trial. We see commonly that this is a reality. Local judges and first instance judges still receiving evidence obtained under torture. So that's concerning. And the last thing is also we did a survey regarding torture in Mexico. And what we found out is that 64% of the Mexican population is afraid that if being detained by any law enforcement official could be subject to torture. So this is not only, we have the numbers about the complaints, we have the numbers about the public perception, and yet when we presented these results to the General Attorney Office, what he said, the General Attorney, is that he didn't agree with our findings, that he thought they were a little bit over the top. And of course we said that we don't agree with him as well. But that is interesting that the Mexican government does not want to acknowledge the dimension of the problem. And we have said repeatedly that this human rights crisis which Mexico is going through is not going to be solved by denying the existence of the problem, but rather by accepting the problem and implementing public policies that to address these issues. Another issue is that of disappeared people. The latest official figure is that in Mexico there are 22,000 disappeared people, or as they like to call them, well, missing people, you know. But the fact is that there are 22,000 people that we don't know where they are and why they are missing. More than that, this is a problem that has been in the public discussion since the very beginning of the administration of President Peña Nieto, and the government has not taken any proper proceeding to find people alive, to kind of investigate why people are being disappeared, how many of those disappearances are enforced disappearances. It did implement a special unit, or did create a special unit for searching missing people, but that unit wasn't backed up with the technical tools that it needed. It only had very few personnel, has around like 30 people working there. For the dimension of the problem that is 22,000, it's not well proportionate, and well, it hasn't also received a political background, so that's also concerning for us. And the last thing is that since 2006, at least, these are the figures that Amnesty International has, at least 80,000 people have died in events related to violence and in events related to this so-called war on drugs that was issued by President Felipe Calderón, and that has kept going under the current administration. The current administration said it was going to change the focus, but it hasn't. So one thing is that the current administration does not talk a lot about the violence as the previous administration did, but that doesn't mean the violence has gone away in Mexico as it doesn't exist. So that's mainly a broad background of what is going on in Mexico from the perspective of Amnesty International. I will pass on to my colleagues, and they can also explain in detail other cases and other things they are also working in Mexico. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good morning. Apologize for arriving a bit late. So I wanted to build on a little bit of what Perseo was saying. I'm Stephanie Brewer. I work in the International Department of Human Rights Center in Mexico City, called the Miguel Agustín Pro Juarez Human Rights Center, or Center Pro, so that we don't have to say that whole name. We work on a range of human rights issues, including civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. But precisely because of the human rights crisis in Mexico over the last few years, tied to public security policies and tied to violence, we have focused a lot on some of the same issues that Perseo already mentioned: torture, failed public security policies, abuses in the criminal justice system. And so I wanted to tie into some of the wider picture of what's going on in Mexico, what's causing these human rights violations. And I also want to start off with an example of a recent high-profile case that you may or may not have heard of, and which for us exemplifies a lot of what's wrong with the public security policies that have been implemented over the past few years. So in June of this year, there was a mass extrajudicial execution committed by Mexican soldiers in the state of Mexico. So within Mexico, there's a Mexico state and then a Mexico City. So within Mexico State. And what happened was that a group of soldiers arrived at a warehouse where there was a group of about 24 civilians. Apparently there was some exchange of fire, and perhaps one of the civilians died in that moment. The rest of the civilians surrendered, but the soldiers went in, shot the people in the legs so that they couldn't move, questioned them, and then shot them in the head. And there was a group of these people who were actually tied up and told the soldiers that they had been kidnapped, and the soldiers separated the men out of the group and killed them. apparently not believing that these men could be victims of kidnapping. And then the women who had been apparently victims of kidnapping were charged with crimes and are detained. So all of this happened. The next day, the local investigating authorities, the local Attorney General's office in Mexico State, said publicly that there had been a shootout between the army and a criminal gang, and that in that shootout, 22 criminals had died and thanked the army for its great work. And it was only because weeks later, one surviving witness went to the media and told the media what had really happened, and her story was published, and these other two women who were detained can confirm it. That's the only reason that the truth actually came out, and that truth is borne out by forensic analysis of the scene. The crime scene was altered by the soldiers, obviously, which is a routine practice, putting guns in everyone's hands and altering where the bodies were. But even so, there's forensic evidence that can show that this is an extrajudicial execution. It wasn't a shootout where everyone died in the crossfire. None of the soldiers died either. And this case, perhaps because of the sort of dramatic turn where the witness came forward, or because of the number of civilian victims, has attracted international attention. It's been coming out in the media. But for us, as an NGO that's been documenting military abuses throughout first the Felipe Calderon administration from 2006 to 2012, and now in the Peña Nieto administration, unfortunately, this is practically business as usual. If we do a statistical analysis of supposed shootouts between armed forces and criminals or civilians during these two administrations, there's an enormous disproportionate focus or disproportionate numbers between military deaths and civilian deaths. So relatively few soldiers are killed in shootouts. Soldiers do tend to be wounded. Civilians tend never to be wounded and survive. That's uncommon, because if they're wounded, the soldiers will kill them. And there's an enormously greater number of civilian deaths than military deaths. This is not to say that no shootouts happen. Of course they do. But these numbers speak of a practice of executions, of finishing off wounded victims, instead of obviously trying to detain any actual criminals, or waiting and using only necessary force instead of going straight to lethal force. So this is an example of why we say that the militarization of public security, the deployment of tens of thousands of soldiers and also members of the Navy to the streets of Mexico to carry out policing tasks, is not a good idea. Obviously, because all those victims have human rights, even if they're criminals, they have the right to life, and so they shouldn't be extrajudicially shot. That's one reason. But there's also a larger structural reason. The execution of civilians, or the arbitrary detention and torture of civilians to extract confessions, as Perseo was saying, which is something we also document in many cases across all of Mexico at all levels. Those practices, aside from violating the rights of the victims, are preventing Mexico from actually addressing the real causes of the violence, actually capturing and prosecuting criminals, dismantling criminal organizations. Because if you have the easy way out of saying, well, these people may or may not be criminals, but I'll kill them and then we can say in the news that we're fighting crime. No. Or, I don't know who actually committed this kidnapping, I'll grab this person on the street, torture them, get a confession, and put them in jail, and then it looks like I'm doing my job, and then I can get my bonus for detaining someone. If you have that easy way out, then you're never going to develop the skills to actually investigate, do intelligence work, and be able to carry out the type of operations that have occurred in other countries to fight organized crime, for instance. There's another structural problem that coexists along with that pattern of substituting human rights abuses for investigations and justice. And that problem is the collusion or complicity, or the fact that instead of having a scenario of over here is the government and the authorities, and over here are criminal groups, and they're in a battle of good against evil, what we have is the criminal groups which are struggling to control Mexico's territory, are also allied with authorities, or authorities form part of those groups, and so everyone is mixed together. And so sometimes when you see actions by authorities to capture people or these supposed shootouts and confrontations, what's really happening isn't necessarily the government is really taking a strong action against crime. What's happening is perhaps authorities allied with or part of one criminal group are acting against criminals, part of another group, but for reasons that are not as admirable and not as productive. So all of this is obviously of great concern for us as human rights organizations in Mexico, but we believe it's also very relevant for the US. The US obviously has an interest, first of all, simply in the security situation of its neighbor, and a country which has so many ties, but also because the US is providing assistance to Mexico, specifically to fight crime. This assistance takes the form of the Merida Initiative and also other types of assistance, like military-to-military assistance, which includes trainings, equipment, and various other types of support. And so a lot of questions need to be asked, and we probably have some very pessimistic and negative answers about how much good is really being done by giving assistance to Mexico's security forces when they are involved in these patterns of systematic human rights violations. I want to say one more thing. So instead of a model of having battles in the streets and having supposed shootouts and mass detentions, of course we say that what needs to happen are professional investigations, and those investigations then logically need to lead to prosecutions and trials. So the criminal justice system in Mexico is right now undergoing a big reform. There's actually a constitutional reform passed in 2008, which is still coming into force gradually over a period of 8 years, and so it should come into force in the whole country by 2016. And this reform aims to transform what has historically been a very archaic, written, inquisitorial justice system into an adversarial oral trial system, which looks a bit more like what we have in the US, although not with citizen juries. And the government is basically presenting this reform as the answer to many of these human rights issues, and saying now with the reform, there won't be torture in order to extract confessions, there won't be illegal evidence, and everything is going to be more transparent. And certainly we fought for this reform, and on paper it does look very good, and we believe it's very important, and we do actually need to implement it. But what we've seen that's very concerning is that even in the states that have already implemented this new system, local authorities and security forces continue to act in the same manner as always. Arbitrary detentions, torture, lack of proper defense, and so you have the same modus operandi, but now it's just changed into an oral trial format. And so this is a big source of alarm for us, and also I think for the US, because precisely one of the areas where the US is giving a lot of assistance and support and really is pushing is the implementation of this criminal justice reform. And so there needs to be a lot of scrutiny on how is this reform actually being implemented. Perhaps even looking at individual cases and programs and saying if the US has trained these judges or these prosecutors in the new system, how are they actually acting? What kind of cases are being decided in this new system? So those are a couple of points we wanted to highlight. We do work on other areas as well, including rights of indigenous people in Mexico, rights of women. Obviously Mexico has an enormous problem with violence against women. We have currently a campaign on sexual torture of women, which I have a few publications on that I'll leave on the table. I also work on migrants' rights, and as you know, migrants are victims of incredible levels of violence, extortion, kidnapping, execution, killing in Mexico at the hands of organized crime and also authorities, which I have a publication as well. I'll leave over there. So I will leave it there for now and turn it over to Maria.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, for the invitation. My name is Luisa Aguilar. I collaborate in the Human Rights Center Tlachinollan. We are based in Guerrero. Guerrero is one of the states with the Guerrero is one of the states with the highest rates of violence, also with the highest rates of poverty, and highly militarized. So everything all mixed in that sense creates the perfect scene for human rights violations, as you know. I want to talk specifically of a case that we are accompanying at the time, which is the case of Iguala that you might actually have heard. The disappearance of the students of... It's the same.
It's the microphone.
Okay. Okay. Yes, so I want to speak about the case of Guerrero, specifically about the disappearances of the students of Ayotzinapa. Not because of just because it's an isolated case, as everybody has been, well, the state wants to present it, but because it's part of this situation, the structural situation that both of my colleagues have already talked about it. Just in case that you have no idea what happened in Guerrero, on September the 26th, the municipality police from Iguala opened fire against 3 buses that were taken by some students from this rural normal school. It's a college that trains teachers. And then hours later, again, a car, people in plain clothes, shoot again the students that were already gathered in this scene. Apart from that, 2 other events, violent events, happened on the same night. And by the end of the night, 6 people had been executed. 3 of them students from this college. 1 kid from this college is still hospitalized with brain damage. 20 other students have been injured, and 43 students were forcibly disappeared. The last time that they saw them, they were actually taken from the bus and packed in some of the municipality police cars. And there are some records that they were actually taken to the prison, but then they were taken out from other municipality police from a municipality that's very close. No? Okay.
Ya, así está bien.
I think that maybe that this is too close to this microphone, so we're going to move matters so she's a little bit soft-spoken.
That work? So, okay. So, yeah, to date, 43 students are still disappeared. And then after that, at least 11 mass graves have been found during the investigations of these events. And these 11 mass graves are just found around the city of Iguala, but the forensic scientists have not yet confirmed whether these are the bodies or have found at least 38 bodies in these 11 mass graves. And they cannot still decide whether they are or not the bodies of the students. So this case exemplifies the reality of Mexico. I mean, this is not an isolated case. This is actually a case that it's just because of the magnitude and because of all the attention that has gathered, has brought a lot of international attention and a lot of resources from the state to actually investigate. But this is actually the exception in that case in terms of investigation. And for us, this case questions a lot of things that the state wants to have always pointed out. First of all, it questions the security strategy in in Mexico, as Stephanie was saying, this is usually a reaction of just violence. I mean, the state has a policy on security that only reacts on violence, that it's based on militarization, but actually doesn't attack the causes of violence in a region where poverty is a reality, where there is a lot of arms everywhere. Like, I mean, it's highly with a lot of weapons in the society, and also it doesn't point out where all the investment of the money from the state goes to the police. I mean, this police from Iguala, from Copula, from all the municipalities that were around this region, every year they have a lot of subsidies from the federal government, but just like granting more money for weapons, money for police cars, but not any kind of reforms on actually how to make a change on groups of police that are clearly involved with organized crime. And this is the second part of what it questions. It questions what Stephanie mentioned, that it's not always bad against good people. I mean, these, usually how it works, like the municipality police are really controlled by one specific group, and depending on who ranks in each region, it's the organized crime group that actually controls the police, and not the mayor or any other authority. And it just shows how deeply and embraces the corruption and the collusion between organized crimes and authorities, but not only at the municipality level, but in all different levels. Because, I mean, there is not only presence of police, of municipality police in these regions. I mean, they are highly militarized, there are a lot of federal police in the region. So it's not just wanted to show, like, okay, so the problem is the municipality police, and then we just need to close it and have one unique body. I mean, it's not as easy. And secondly, and thirdly, it will actually give us the idea of the magnitude of disappearances in Mexico. As Perseo already mentioned, the official number of people disappeared in Mexico is of 22,000 people in the last 7 years. Only in this, during this administration, there have the records of 8,000 people disappeared. So we have 8,000 people that we don't know where they are, and there are 43 more just in the last month. So it also shows the lack of capacity of the state to investigate. There's been 35 days where the first week the federal government didn't actually enter to the investigation, or it actually didn't deploy any forces or any capacities to investigate on the issues. But then after the pressure, or the international pressure, the international pressure, they came in. And after finding 11 mass graves, they haven't been able to identify who's these people are. The families, as they don't trust the authorities, they brought an independent expert group, the Argentinian forensic group, for them to identify if these bodies are their relatives or not. But there is no trust on the state. I mean, in many other cases, victims have been just delivered bodies that are not their relatives, either in Juarez, or in cases of high-profile cases as the migrants that were in San Fernando, in Tamaulipas. I mean, even in Mexico City they haven't case. I mean, it's a reality that people will not trust what the government will just want, because the government will just want to close the case and move on. But it also shows how there is no capacity to identify if these are not the children or the students from this event, then how, I mean, these are somebody's persons, not somebody's relatives. So what is the state going to do to make sure that they could find families who are looking for these relatives. And to be honest, we don't think that they have the capacity to do so. As well, they don't have the capacity to investigate and to actually investigate not only what happened during these events, because at today, 35 days after, they don't actually know what happened to the students, but they also have not been able to link all the collusion between different authorities. And we are speaking about a mayor in a small city in Guerrero who has been actually identified as one of the intellectual actors of a murder of 3 activists last year in the same city, whose case actually was involved in the State Department human rights report, and who just actually asked for license and then he ran away. I mean, he's gone. So yeah, the state doesn't, or either doesn't have the capacity or doesn't want to actually chase who's all the authorities that are related in this case. So I would just finish saying that even though this case might have had a lot of international attention, and that's why it's brought to many of you by the media or other resources, this is not an isolated case, and this is an important part of what we were talking about here. This is the reality that Perseo was talking about and Stephanie, and it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Thank you, thank you. We have about 10-15 minutes if anyone has any questions or comments for our guests.
Hi, my name is Erika. We know that it's difficult in Mexico to fight against crime because there are many heads or leaders of the government who might be involved in corruption. So have you considered pushing the laws in order to investigate the leaders of the government and where their money comes from? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's not necessarily a problem of legislation, because in theory, if there is an unexplained, I'm trying to think of how to say it in English, unexplained enrichment. So if a government official suddenly has a ton of money that is beyond his or her salary, or it turns out they have 10 mansions, that is something that should already be investigated. There are certain obstacles in terms of investigating and especially prosecuting government authorities because they have immunity at certain levels. The higher level officials do have immunity, but even current legislation would permit for a process that would take away that immunity. So it's not as much of a legislative problem, and in fact that's a common theme, that's a factor that is at play in all of what we've been saying. The problem is not so much legislation. In fact, Mexico now has a constitution that incorporates human rights treaties, for instance. And so we have these laws, and the problem is that laws historically are not applied and are not complied with. But certainly that is a very good point. If the Mexican government really wants to tackle crime head on, then where it could start looking is precisely at many of these government officials.
I have a question, just to complement a little bit of what Stephanie said. We have to be very careful about not falling in the trick that like everything that is happening in the country is because of organized crime. So like over the last 8-7 years, one easy way out from the government about all this human rights violation has been saying, listen, it's not us, it's organized crime, who is doing all these bad things, and we're just trying to fight this evil. And as Stephanie was saying, if you're trying to fight evil with human rights violation, then you are not really solving the problem. You are just like creating a vicious cycle, or vicious circle that would lead you to more human rights violation, and to lead you to more violence, and to lead you to more of these things. So, like, I just want to point out that, and also to say as well, it's not a problem only about having good laws, it's about enforcing those good laws. But more than that, it's also about having a massive support to human rights. Because similar to what happened here in the US, and sorry for being a little bit unpolitically correct, like people buy the idea that there is a trade-off between security and human rights. So either you want to have security or human rights, and that is a lie, at least to me, and the way I see it. You can't have good national security or public security policies that do have a human rights approach, and that are the ones that are going to be more successful, as Stephanie was explaining before.
I just had a question. So I understand, I've been kind of listening in, and I understand what's happening. It's really bad, but what exactly do you want the U.S. federal government to do? We don't have legislative authority in Mexico. Do you propose, like, you know, we are providing them with a lot of aid, so you're proposing kind of perhaps threatening to tighten up on the aid if they don't, you know, get their act together? What are we supposed to do about the problem?
I just want to answer a little bit on. We were talking this week also with staff from the Senate, and one of the staff made a very good point. It's that the U.S. always expressed concerns for what happened, like for human rights situation in Nigeria or like other countries, but hasn't expressed its concern about the human rights situation in Mexico. So one thing that works a lot and works even more with this government is public shaming. Like in the international media over the last 2 years, Mexico was the emerging power. Mexico was the state that was taking these big so-called structural reforms. Like we were going and we were ready to, kind of like take off and be that economic power. And that's a lie, because we don't have good human rights policies. And if you don't have good human rights policies, you can have growth, maybe. You're not going to have development. And we've said that repeatedly. And that is one thing. And then, as I was saying, under the Maryland initiative, there has been a lot of training in Mexican police authorities or law enforcement authorities, but it has lacked a lot of monitoring and evaluation. So far that money that you have spent in Mexico, you just have spent it without knowing what happens to that money. I mean, at least, I'm sure that at least every single federal agent has received a human rights training. You just put them in a classroom, you see them, you talk about human rights, and then they go and then they do business as usual. So you are not spending the money wisely. So that is something that can be. Of course, we know you don't have a legislative authority under Mexico. Also, we don't want that to happen, but Amnesty International works, and I think it's a good principle, international solidarity. And we want international solidarity, not only from the federal government, but also from the Congress, but also from you, from the citizens, and to raise those concerns. That's something that we would like to have as well.
Just to add one quick point to what Perseo was saying, and as you're probably aware, the U.S. actually has already formally conditioned a part of the the funding under the Merit Initiative of 50%, condition that, saying that the U.S. can only release it if Mexico, well, if the State Department reports that Mexico is complying or advancing or fulfilling certain human rights obligations, which, by the way, are not laws imposed by the U.S. or something that the U.S. government invented. They're human rights obligations Mexico already had by ratifying treaties. So the U.S. is saying, okay, we're going to give you, this money and assistance and training, but this percentage is going to be withheld if you're not meeting certain human rights obligations. And what's happened year after year is that the U.S. does release that money even though it's absolutely clear that Mexico is not meeting those obligations. And so I would kind of turn the question back around and say, look, we did not, we didn't come here asking for the U.S. government to give assistance programs to Mexico, but the U.S. decided to do that. And the U.S. decided to condition part of the funds and make this statement on human rights, saying it's important to us to know our money is not funding human rights violations. But the U.S. government is not complying with its own rule in that regard, and so it's not sending that message. So if you're going to say it, you've got to live up to it. And so that's something very specific that the U.S. could do, is start honestly evaluating the situation, saying, we're not going to give these funds. Or, and what would probably be more, what's really called for is a rethinking, really, of the Merit Initiative or other types of funding, military funding, for instance, really evaluating, who are we supporting here? What could be the effect of these programs?
And just to comment on that too, there are some sheets there. All of our organizations actually work together and try and inform State Department on these issues when they do their reporting on the data initiative. So we have a brief summary there of the conditions and where our assessment has been on it, as well as some other specific suggestions on how we should engage with Mexico's police, for example. I think in the case of Iguala, are there more openings to work on investigations in Mexico with them? So there's a couple, but I think Stephanie's right. We would agree there's a lot on the human rights of Congress using its leverage on this as well.
Just to add on the human rights requirement, for the past at least 2 years, if not more, the House has removed the human rights requirements from appropriations bills while the Senate has kept them in. So something that particularly those of you who are coming from offices that are appropriators, but really all offices should be encouraging appropriators to maintain those human rights requirements as a really important marker of the United States' commitment to human rights in its foreign policy in Mexico and other countries in Latin America.
So a major theme has been the gap between the laws that are on the books and the actual enforcement, and Perseo was talking, and he as well as me, about the trainings that we offer, but how it just goes on business as usual after a day in the classroom. What's the real impact? I'm wondering if you think that there is an actual opportunity for the U.S. or other allies to actually make an impact on the ground with that sort of local training, or if some other approach would be more effective.
So I can resist a question on training. What we have to understand is that a Mexican police officer or soldier or prosecutor or judge or defender, any of these people, in order to keep your job, you need to play by the rules. You need to fit into the system that's already established. And that's a system of corruption. It's a system of human rights abuses and silence and impunity. It's a system where you cannot obviously rat out on your colleagues, on your boss. You have to participate, and this is one of the first things that you'll need to do. And so you can't mess with that system if you want to be able to continue in your job. And if you do, best case scenario, you'll be fired, or you may now be next. There are many cases of actually, obviously, police, military, who themselves are victims of human rights violations, who are falsely accused of crimes, etc. So when you're living in that system, and then one day a note comes and says, report for human rights training, and probably additionally your boss will tell you, oh, you have to go and do this training, but, it doesn't matter and doesn't change anything, but you have to go sit there. then you're going to go and sit in the classroom already knowing that it's irrelevant. You're not going to be able to apply what you're learning. So in that situation, trainings are really not an efficient way of improving human rights practices. Also, we're not talking generally, obviously some exceptions, such as the new criminal justice system that does require training simply because people don't know how to implement it or how to use it if they're not trained. It's a completely new system. But the types of abuses we're talking about, torture, forced disappearance, execution, how much training do you really need to understand that you shouldn't arbitrarily detain someone, burn them, beat them, asphyxiate them, and then invent criminal charges against them or disappear someone? That does not require hours in a classroom. You know that's wrong, you know that's illegal, but you also know that that's happening. So for us, we really, we think that training in those contexts, training not to torture, not an efficient intervention. So we would say training should really be focused on technical areas. The big example being right now the new criminal justice system, because that is where we need actual technical capacitation. But in terms of these big issues, torture, disappearance, we see more of a role through obviously encouraging prosecutions and punishment and accountability. And that can come through, as Perseo was saying, both public pressure, private pressure. Like it or not, you know, for us, we may or may not like it, the U.S. has an enormous influence and impact on Mexico. For the Mexican government, there's no other government as important. And so if the U.S. really seriously pressures on these areas, that could have an effect.
No, maybe just using again the same case where that I was talking about. I mean, what Stephanie says, it's very important. I mean, technical support and cooperation and things that are actually useful for investigation. I mean, we don't have the capacity to, as I say, to identify whose bodies are that. I mean, or to create databases about disappearances, or to actually have, I don't know, like appropriate technology to look for people who could be still alive. I mean, like, so those kind of things will be more useful than just basically trainings on how not to torture or other stuff.
Thank you all for coming, for your time. Thanks to our colleagues from